Good evening, everybody. Welcome. If you're new to these events, perhaps I ought to just say a little bit about what Uncertain Minds is intended to be all about. This is the third in a series of discussions that we're having with prominent people, trying to model a different sort of conversation, I guess, about the relationship between belief and unbelief. Perhaps a conversation that's not caught up in those sort of binary boo-hurrahs of culture wars about this subject. We've had a distinguished number of people, and we have another one tonight. John Gray he used to be Professor of European Thought at the LSE, that's right, isn't it? And in America and various other places, but perhaps best known to people as an author of an extraordinary range of, I would say, brilliant books. I've benefited hugely from his work on Isaiah Berlin and liberalism, and his Black Mass and Straw Dogs, and recently the Immortalization Commission, which, if you haven't read that, you really ought to. It's absolutely fantastic. So it's great to have John Gray with us. How this will work is John will talk for 15-20 minutes, and then I'll have a little banter with him for 5 or 10 minutes, and then we'll throw it open to the floor, and I'll try and moderate some questions.
Well, thank you very much, Giles, for that very generous introduction. In one of the books he mentioned, I speculated that in an age of secular dogmatism, churches might become sanctuaries of doubt. And I think this conversations that are being held here suggest that that wasn't entirely wild speculation. But in the spirit of what Giles said about the type of conversations that are being held here, I don't want to persuade anyone here of anything, or persuade them from holding anything that they hold, any idea they have altogether, but rather just to suggest a few thoughts, three in particular, about the ways in which the categories of thinking we inherit from Christian monotheism shape secular thinking and make it more brittle and dogmatic, and I would say also more shallow in many ways than the traditions it draws upon. And in fact, I'll argue that when people talk about secular thinking or secular humanism or any of these kind of arguments, secularity as a more abstract notion is in fact a wholly post-Christian way of thinking, that unless there'd been Christianity, unless there'd been Christian monotheism, one couldn't really even talk in these terms at all. The notion of secularity means nothing it seems to me, in the Greece of polytheism and Plato and Socrates. It doesn't mean anything much really outside monotheism itself, and in fact that raises the question, which I'll also talk a bit about, what religion is at all, because there is a view which says that there's no such thing as religion, that religion is just a sort of variety of different social practices and human engagements with nothing at the heart of them. And I think that's a sort of slightly hyperbolical way of saying something which is true, which is that religion is extremely diverse. The best book ever written, at least by a philosopher, on religion is one that's still in print, William James's Varieties of Religious Experience. Perhaps a perfectly wonderful book, and not only because most philosophers are obsessionally secular in their thinking and theologically illiterate to the last degree. That's not the only reason. It's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful book. I strongly recommend you to read it. And one of the features of it is it says that there are many different religious moods. Religion has various different, many different or even competing uses and roles in human life. And it's not a kind of a primitive version of science. It doesn't consist of theories. I tend to think myself that even the very ideas of belief and unbelief are ones we should probably discard, because they carry with them the notion that at the core of religion is some kind of set of propositions or statements, some kind of creedal framework, which of course is true of some religions, including at least in part of its history, Anglicanism, but it's not true of many religions, and not even true of large parts of Christian traditions, that creeds are at the heart of it, or that propositions or beliefs. I'm not in general a tremendous reader of P.G. Wodehouse, but towards the end of his life he was interviewed by someone from the BBC, and he said, I think, one of the wisest things that can be said on these subjects that I've ever heard. He was asked by the BBC interviewer a rather good question. The question was not, what are your religious beliefs, Mr. Wodehouse? The question was, do you have any religious beliefs, Mr. Wodehouse? To which P.G. Wodehouse replied, frightfully hard to say, you know. And I think that's terribly good, because what it recognizes is the elusiveness of what we call belief. What belief might be or not be. In fact, it might be just a kind of a mistaken idea in these contexts, produced, I think, that's just my view, by the deformation of the tradition which came from Judaism by Greek philosophy, by the attempt to marry Greek philosophy in Christian Platonism and Aristotelian Christianity and Thomism and so on, which is, of course, is a large part of the Western project. I think it was a mistake, but that's a different story. So I have, in fact, 3 thoughts to put before you, just thoughts. I say I'm not trying to convince you of them, just something which might be interesting to think about the way in which religion, taken as a kind of family resemblance way, taken as a kind of network or extended family of practices and categories, ways of thinking, has shaped secular thinking in our time. And I'll begin with a reference, the only one I'll make tonight, to the book I've just published called The Immortalization Commission, which is about scientific attempts to use science to defeat death, to cheat death, to circumvent death. And it looks in 2 in particular, one in Edwardian England and one in Bolshevik Russia. And in the one in Victorian Edwardian England, went on until the 30s, there is a sort of slightly fantastical but historically true project was attempted. It's almost hard to describe it without making it sound even more absurd than it was. The idea was cherished by a number of leading psychical researchers, who included Arthur Balfour's brother, Gerald Balfour, leading conservative statesman who'd been Secretary of State in Northern Ireland, who gave up his political career to pursue the study of the paranormal. The idea developed at some point that deceased scientists in the afterlife, were using eugenics, the science as they thought of it as eugenics, to design a messianic child who would appear in the world and bring peace and harmony to a troubled species. And that was the idea. A child was born, the natural child of Balfour's brother and a woman who worked as an automatist, a medium under a pseudonym. She was, in fact, a friend of Lloyd George, leading suffragist, and British High Representative of the League of Nations later on. But her role in all this only came out in about 50 years later. And why that interested me is that it's an example of a very specific transposition of categories from monotheism, from Christian monotheism, to science. I mean, not all religions have an idea of a messianic figure. That's a specifically Jewish and Christian idea. Not all religions have an idea of salvation in time. Very important point. Many religions, Buddhism, in many of its traditions, Hinduism, see salvation as involving, and Platonism in Western traditions and mystical philosophies of Platonism and Neoplatonism. If they have an idea of salvation, which I think they do, it's an idea of escape from time or exit from time. Salvation isn't an event which happens in the history of the species, or it isn't even a kind of an end of time or an end of history or anything of that kind. It's an individual. It's something that can happen to an individual, whereby that individual is somehow exempted from the penalties of time. But this idea of a Messiah was given a specifically scientific reformulation in the context of this rather fantastic episode in Edwardian psychical research, something which wasn't, as it were, cooked up by just a few crazy people, but I mean the people involved in this broad thing, though not in this project specifically, but in the broad project around it, included Henry Sidgwick, 30 years of his life spent on this kind of thing, one of the greatest Victorian public intellectuals, probably I think the best moral theorist, more interesting and more profound than John Stuart Mill. Arthur Balfour himself was heavily involved at various points of his life and so on. F.W.H. Myers, various leading scientists, Freud for a while, was sympathetic to various aspects of it. So this, and the core of it, I think, was the idea that science could replicate some of the, if you like, salvific role that Christian monotheism had in the past, could deliver us from chaos and misery in the world, could even be used to produce a messianic child. And by the way, the child who was born, it doesn't seem to have been told very much about his role in life until later on, and probably never all. He had an interesting life, although not a messianic one. He grew up, went to Cambridge, studied philosophy with C.D. Broad, also a psychic researcher, met Wittgenstein. The war came, went into the war. He joined the Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, where he worked with Kim Philby for a while, did a bit of that after the war, part of it in Iraq, then British Iraq, and then converted to Catholicism and became a monk and spent his last decades as a monk in Downside. And I recently had the pleasant experience of someone walking up to me and said, well, I met the Messiah, you know. Although I didn't know it was the Messiah when I met him. He was teaching me a Downside. So since then I've met people who knew him. He knew nothing of it. That's not true. By the time he knew something of it, but never all. He even attempted through mediums to contact his dead mother to find out more. And there are some rather strange texts extant about that. So the significance of all this is a kind of rather extreme example, if you like, rather far-fetched nowadays, it sounds, of science replicating not just religious, but specifically Judeo-Christian categories of thinking, in particular the idea of a messianic figure that can redeem or turn around, in some case transform history. But it's not over by any means, because if you actually look to 21st century thought, there are people like Ray Kurzweil. Anyone heard of him here? He's an American writer, a kind of futurist, who talks constantly, I'm sure he knows no history of religion, about something he calls the singularity, which is about to happen quite soon, within his lifetime, by the way. We know that because he's on a special diet which will keep him alive long enough to experience the singularity. And the singularity means an explosive interaction of scientific knowledge, as a result of which it will become possible, he thinks, for humans to achieve immortality by being uploaded into a virtual world of cyberspace. And he's actually published a diet book, if any of you are interested in living that long. So that, because he thinks it'll happen within the next 30 or 40 years. It's all complete nonsense, but quite influential. He raised a lot of money, and he's cited with reverence, if you're interested in this, by leading historians and archaeologists now. There's a book called Why the West has ruled until now, by an American archaeologist at Stanford, one of the leading archaeologists in America. The last 50 pages, you learn a lot about archaeology in the first 400 pages. In the last 50 pages, he says, well, that's all irrelevant now because there's no more geography, there's no more biology, there's no more East, there's no more West. We're all going to be uploaded shortly. And then that will all be irrelevant. And he comes out with one of the best sentences, I think, kind of best absurdist sentences. I couldn't have invented it myself. Come across, he said, and thus we see, he says, we look back on the our magnificent journey from the amoeba to the singularity. So we started as amoeba, but being discontented with being amoeba occurred to us we might want to be human beings. So we sort of got involved in the evolutionary competition and eventually emerged as we are, but now we're fed up with being human beings because human beings die, they have frail bodies, they fight each other, they have wars and terrible conflicts. So we're going to be uploaded into a condition where we don't have any of these things. So as I say, completely absurd, but it's a kind of example of this kind of thing will never go away. In fact, one of my theses, I just ideas, and not really a thesis, one I would put forward for your consideration, not that you necessarily need to accept it, is this kind of the encrypting of messianic and other religious ideas into secular thinking, because Kurzweil, like the psychoresearchers, were avowedly secular, claimed to have left religion in the past, is a sort of disorder of our modern culture which is not curable, which is not alterable. In other words, I'm not saying think about it in a different way and we can get out of this difficulty. It's too deeply rooted in modern ways of thinking. The imprint of religion on secular thought is too profound, really, to escape it. We can't escape this with all of its absurdities. The most that we can do, some of us, if we're interested, is be aware of it and then try and think of more interesting alternatives. But it's not something that can, in fact, be remedied. Although I think it's a fundamental error, a basic illusion, a terrible mistake. It's not something that we can expect to change. And that leads me to my first really kind of thought was about the way science, and it's had, of course, different embodiments in Russia and elsewhere, in early Bolshevik Russia and elsewhere, the way science, it's imagined that science can be used by humans to, as it were, rid the world of immemorial evils, if not to bring about a utopian state of affairs, then at least to march to a better and better kind of state of affairs for the human species. All of these kind of ideas seem to me to be transpositions of religious conceptions of history, among other things, into secular thought. And that leads me to my kind of second thought, which is that many of the political doctrines, and not just scientific theories and doctrines, but political doctrines of the modern period involve a transposition of a redemptive notion of history, an idea that history is a process of moral redemption, an idea that history involves a kind of, in a sense, progressive unfoldment of a moral drama. And you'll find this in thinkers who were never exposed to religion. For example, one thinker I spent many years of my life studying, John Stuart Mill, I mentioned him earlier, was brought up in a wholly non-religious, and as they thought, secular environment by his father. Yet we find in Mill, as in many liberal writers, and also, of course, in Marxist writers, the idea of human history as a series of successive phases through which societies go, starting, as it were, in unconsciousness. Terrible conflicts occur, tremendous battles and forms of slavery and exploitation. And then at some point in the future, a higher form of human development arises, in which the horrors of the past are left behind. So there are no more wars, no more tyrannies, no more cruelty, no more meaningless historical conflicts. And the nature of this telos in history, the nature of this endpoint of history, of course, differs according to the theorist. It might be in Marx, it might be communism. In Mill, it was some form of individualist liberal society. In Friedrich Hayek or Herbert Spencer, it was laissez-faire capitalism. Later on in Fukuyama, it was what he called democratic capitalism. But in all of these theories, history is conceived of as a purposive process, a process with a direction, an end point. It's not necessarily inevitable, there's no inevitability in it, but if the kind of normal pattern of historical development is towards some moral goal. Now, the interesting thing about that is you won't find that in ancient Greek and Roman historians. There's nothing like that in ancient Greek and Roman historians. History is seen as a series of particular episodes linked together by chains of cause and effect or human actions. Chance plays a role and so on, the whim of the gods, etc. The idea that human history is sort of going anywhere, or that it has some overall meaning, or that it's in any sense a redemptive process, isn't there. Nor is it in Greek drama, Greek tragic drama, because there you have the idea that particular choices or decisions or even someone's character can trigger a whole series of fatal events or fateful events which once triggered can't be stopped. And there may be nothing at all redemptive in that process, nothing. That's another different possibility. Or then again in non-historical religions which which don't see history as a kind of side of salvation, certain types of Platonism, of pre-Christian mystery religions in ancient Europe, and also some versions of Buddhism and Hinduism. History is just, in a sense, a dream, or a succession of dreams, and salvation involves waking up as an individual, but not as the species. And the dream simply repeats. I mean, the dominant trope of historical understanding in the pre-Christian and non-Christian world has always been cycles, which repeat themselves. And that's a view which I find quite plausible myself. Secular thinking, I think, is completely shaped by what's inherited from monotheism. But of course, in a way, the interesting bits are left out. That's to say, the difference between, say, Augustine's view of history, and in which there is an underlying providential pattern, and the secular theories that Augustine says you can't know it. There's a kind of veil between us and it. God knows it, but we don't. Whereas in Marxism and certainly types of liberalism, many types of liberalism, the idea is it can be known, it can even be formulated, that the pattern of historical development. This is, by the way, it's which kind of tremendously alive today. It's not at all a myth. It's not at all something left behind. It is a myth, of course. It's a rather silly myth, but it's not one that's been left behind. I used to know in the 1980s and then the 90s some of the neoconservatives in America who were very bullish, who kind of agitate for the Iraq War. And one of their views was that, the only thing holding back Iraq from becoming a secular democracy like the United States, not that the United States is that secular, by the way, but and not that fundamentalism has no impact at all on public life either. But the only thing that was holding back was a tyrant. A tyrant. If you got rid of the tyrant, then it would surge towards its the full secular forces would be immediately released. And if you want to check this, look up on the internet with what Wolfowitz said about the Shia. He said the Shia, of course, are profoundly secular. I don't know how he knew that, or what he was relying upon, some special CIA report perhaps that he commissioned, or although he was hostile to the CIA because he tended, one has read that when they told him it might not be quite like that, there might be quite a lot of religious, even theocrats. And no, that's all nonsense. They're all basically secular, the whole thing. It's only tyranny. So you get rid of the tyranny and boom, you're in the next phase. And a very similar idea, and I know this to be true, was held by Milton Friedman about the former Soviet Union. Get rid of the Soviet state and you would have free markets, because free markets were natural and they were written into the telos of human history. All human history was tending to produce a kind of global free market. So it's deeply rooted, this teleological thinking, and in fact people cling on to it as a sort of kind of talisman, you might say, a magic talisman, which preserves the meaning of their lives. So if your life is bound up with various improving projects, if you think that without this belief, then the project you're interested in might just vanish, trickle away, be replaced by something else, or swept away, then it'll be kind of rather depressing for many people. And I've had people say, well, if I thought as you do, I wouldn't get up in the morning, so I had to reply, well, stay in bed a bit longer, you might find a better reason for getting up in the morning than simply having these beliefs to avoid depression. Suggest to you, by the way, that kind of the underlying state is one of crypto despair, because if you didn't have if you weren't so afraid, it's not kind of genuine belief. Like someone wrote about John Stuart Mill. Let me get it right. John Stuart Mill wrote about religion. He said, religion in Victorian England, he said, religion in our time, he said, from being a straitjacket has turned into a dressing gown. And I think that's kind of something in that. Certainly now. The idea that we've sort of got to believe in, otherwise fall into despair, that applies to these secular religions, these secular creeds, these secular projects. In other words, if you didn't believe that the whole world was trending towards human rights or democracy or the global free market or some other nonsense, it would fall into despair. Well, the third, because I'm going to stop now shortly, is the third thing I wanted to just talk about a little bit briefly in conclusion, though I mentioned it at the start, is the idea of salvation in time. And in other words, the idea of religion is essentially a kind of activist ethical project. The idea that what the test of a religion is what change it can actually make in the world, and what improvements can be made in the world. And I suppose, and the way in which religion has, I think, Western religion has, quite a lot of it has been tied up with ideas of world improvement, probably at least since Pelagius. I mean, one of the kind of dominant thinkers, I think now, although not many people who are shaped by him didn't know his name, is Pelagianism, which was always regarded as a heresy, which is again the idea that only circumstances or ignorance or oppression hold back the inherent goodness, the inherent advance of the human species, kind of Pelagianism, from which a lot of subsequent Enlightenment thinking, not all Enlightenment thinkers thought like this, by the way. Hobbes didn't, Spinoza didn't, but later on Freud didn't. But quite a lot of secular thinkers, secular Enlightenment thinkers, have taken this view, and of course it raises a sort of secular version of the problem of evil. If evil is just error, why are human beings so fond of error? I mean, there's a secular kind of issue there, which is as insoluble, a secular problem of evil, as insoluble or as much of a challenge to the reason, at any rate, as in Christian monotheism. But what this kind of close on is that within the broad family of things we describe as religion or think of as religion, there are of course many strands which don't have anything very much to do with transforming the world or improving the world. All religions, or most religions, contain contemplative traditions, and many philosophies which stand outside Christian monotheism had including monotheism, including Platonism and Neoplatonism, including the ancient mystery religions, including, of course, Buddhism and Hinduism and others, have had ideas of the contemplative life, which have not been justified, although they can be, I'm aware of that, but which historically have not always been, or even often been, cashed out or explained in terms of the value of contemplation to other human beings. I'm reminded, you might think this is rather frivolous, but in Russian Christianity, in Orthodox Christianity, there's kind of a well-known severance, this kind of well-known distinction between holiness and moral virtue. I mean, in other words, a holy person can be kind of morally not very admirable. And I came across this in a post-revolutionary Russian writer who ended up in Germany, Merezhkovsky. I don't know if any of you read him, but he actually invented a Russian saint to embody this idea. It was called Tihon the Sordid. And Tihon the Sordid had the very worst, because the pettiest vices. He gossiped nastily about other saints, borrowed cigarettes, didn't give them back, made small promises, didn't keep them. But despite all this, he was tremendously holy. Now, I sort of like this myself, and because it was actually sort of, he was, by the way, not at all a critic of Russian Orthodoxy, Merezhkovsky. He was a tremendous admirer of it, held to a version of it towards the end of his life very passionately. So he wanted to make this kind of distinction between the virtues, ethical virtues, and practical virtues, and holiness. And I think that one which is sort of alien to the more Western Greek traditions of Christianity and the ones we have today. And so one thing which I think sort of deserves recovery in religious traditions, not just Christianity or Anglicanism or even monotheism, but more generally, and which perhaps deserves recovery outside of what we can't conventionally think of religion altogether, is the idea that looking at the world, contemplating the world, finding the world beautiful and wonderful, can have value intrinsically and inherently in and of itself, regardless, entirely regardless of any good effects it might have on the world. Thank you.